Okay, hello. Hopefully you're learning lots about World War II history and enjoying it as much as I am. Today we're going to be talking about the notes. So you're going to want to have them out, the blue note packet. And if you have your readings on Peleliu and Market Garden, those would be good to have out as well. So you can always pause this to go get them. I'd like to start today first by mentioning one of my favorite heroes from World War II. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now we'll talk about Bonhoeffer in a later video when we start talking about more about the Holocaust. But if you remember at the very beginning of our World War II unit, we talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer as he was a minister for the Confessing Church in Germany. So the Confessing Church, if you don't recall, split off from the German Christian Church when the German Christian Church embraced Hitler and swastikas and the whole Nazi movement. And the Confessing Church basically said, we ought to honor God rather than any man, especially Hitler. And when Hitler began speaking out against the Jews and the German Christian Church began adopting anti-Semitic policies, the Confessing Church broke away, and Bonhoeffer was one of the leaders. And although Bonhoeffer was able to leave Germany, he wasn't a Jew. He was from a leading aristocratic family. He was in London and America as late as 1939 and felt compelled to go back to Germany to be with his people in this crisis. He thought he was fleeing a responsibility, and so he set up a seminary. He was training students in the ministry, and then that got shut down, and then he joined the resistance. He was actually technically part of the Nazi intelligence network, but he was actually working in counterintelligence, smuggled Jews out to Switzerland, but eventually he was arrested for being part of the resistance, and he had been involved in a couple of plots to kill Hitler. We'll talk more about that in a later video, but on this date, April 9, in 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed by order of Hitler, and that was about almost exactly a month before Germany surrendered in the war. And so he was a martyr. He died for his faith and his beliefs in his fight against the Nazis as a heroic voice in Germany. So thinking about that today, I just finished reading a book about his life to my children. And so just very convicting, his heroics and his willingness to fight against evil in his country. All right, so the first thing I want to look at is the reading on Peleliu. Oops. Sorry, I gotta hit the wrong button. Okay. All right, so you might have this out, but I have it here for your reference. So if you remember, we watched part of a documentary on Peleliu, and we looked at how it's just this little dinky island, and the Marine Corps thought that we would take it in just a matter of days, and then instead it took a very long time. They had all kinds of problems at Peleliu. They had water problems because people accidentally put drinking water in and used gas cans, which tainted the water. They had over 100-degree temperatures. Men were dying, heat stroke exposure. And then the Japanese employed a new technique here, which is summarized in this paragraph, talking about how the Japanese in Urumbogo Mountain, they, instead of having like one front line with all their troops and retreating, the Japanese dug in at the most defensible positions on the island. And no matter which direction the Americans came from, the Japanese had them covered by machine guns, mortars, artillery, and so the goal of the Japanese was to exact maximum casualties, and that's what EB Sledge, the author of this book with the old breed, is talking about here, and the casualties that were inflicted because of this. And then the Japanese would improve upon this battle plan at Iwo Jima and then again at Okinawa. And so the Japanese were changing tactics. They were adapting to this island fighting style. And the result was many thousand more Americans were being killed. Another note in this reading was just looking at how EB Sledge referred to heavy shelling, and just he mentions here to be under heavy shelling was, to me, by far the most terrifying of combat experiencing, complete helplessness, forlorn, fatalistic. Different people have described it different ways, but this is a recurring theme. If you read books about World War II vets, they'll talk about being shelled by the Germans or the Japs, and their teeth rattling and all their muscles tense, and just agony as men around them are dying, and just terror, absolute terror. Then we get this story of Bill, where the Japanese, if you remember in the reading we did in the Philippines, the Kirokumi, who were the Japanese who dressed in minimal clothing and snuck out in the dead of night and attacked Americans. There was a Kirokumi attack, and because one of these Americans, Sam, fell asleep, Bill, who was supposed to be sleeping, right? There's two men in the foxhole. One was at watch. One was supposed to sleep. Bill was sleeping. Sam was supposed to be on watch. It was not. And the end result was this terrible situation where Bill was shot by his own men, and just terror, right? And Sam takes the brunt of this because he failed. He failed his mission to be on watch, and his friend died because of it. And then you had the other American who killed him, had an accident, but that still weighed heavily. And this was just another terrible thing that could happen in war. So hopefully you got something out of this reading on Peleliu and just how horrible of a battle it was. And this EB Sledge, he says at the end, it was the training that the Marine Corps provided, the esprit de corps, the pride of what it was to be a Marine, that semper fi, right? Always faithful. That's what pulled the Marine Corps through battles like Peleliu. All right, we're going to shift gears and go back to the European theater of war. So I'm trying to cover this relatively chronologically. And we're going to talk about the Battle of Market Garden. Let me back up here. All right, so here's a map. So Operation Market Garden was the largest paratrooper operation in history. And the goal here was our troops were back in France, into Belgium, and we wanted to cross into Germany. And so Bernard Montgomery, Monty, this British general, had this plan. If we dropped in paratroopers in the Netherlands, and then we captured key bridges and crossed over into Germany. So you can see the Germany-Netherlands border here. And so these paratroopers were supposed to grab these key bridges over the rivers to get into Germany. And so the farthest bridges away from our controlled area were Nijmegen and Arnhem. And it was the bridge at Arnhem that we would fail to take. Market Garden was a failure. And so sometimes this is referred to as the bridge too far. And that's the famous book that Cornelius Ryan wrote that you read pieces from. So the idea here was we were going to drop paratroopers in and take these key bridges, and we're going to have tank divisions come up in support, and we were going to cross into Germany and end the war by Christmas. This was in September of 1944, so several months after D-Day. And so we also, in addition to paratroopers, we also had these gliders. So these gliders were these massive aircraft that could hold tanks and jeeps and other vehicles, and then they were towed behind other planes. So they literally towed to take off, and then they would be towed all the way over the drop zone, the DZ, and then the cords would be detached, and the gliders would glide in and land and drop off tanks and other necessary vehicles. So you have paratroopers and massive formations of gliders. Let's go a second to the reading. From a bridge too far. We'll point out a couple things here. So the first part is just looking at our intelligence. We knew a day or two in advance before this operation that the Germans had tanks near Arnhem, more tanks than we had anticipated. And that's a huge problem when you're dealing with infantry, paratroopers who didn't necessarily have the power to take out big German tanks. And Schaeff, just looking at this, Supreme Headquarters of the Allies. So the idea was, you know, we knew we had the intel, but Bernard Montgomery ignored it. He was notoriously arrogant. And yeah, so then this next section here looks at just our C-47s, big cargo planes, our paratroopers, and just what they had to fly through, the flak, getting hit. If you remember the Burt Stiles video about these clouds of flak and our pilots flying through them and trying to drop paratroopers over the drop zones and then to their own peril. And so this looks at some problems we had, not only that we had intelligence, we didn't use it. The Dutch resistance, the Dutch people who were fighting against the Germans covertly also could have supplied us key information. We didn't really contact them, and perhaps because we were worried that we didn't know who to trust, but they could have provided valuable intelligence. So then our radios, we had all kinds of communication issues. Our commanders didn't know what was going on because our radios were down, and so we were really blind to what was happening in the battle. Then one of our gliders was shot down, and the Germans recovered it, and it had our battle plans, kind of similar in the Civil War to when we found Robert E. Lee's battle plans wrapped around cigars before the Battle of Antietam. Well, here the Germans found our plans, and that was a huge misfortune. And then we had this ferry that we could have used to bypass key German strongholds, and we didn't use it. And so this little note talks about that. And that could have changed the course of the battle as well. This is just a little note about how the Dutch used dead bodies to try to block the German advance. This is just talking about how big our planes and such were. So like a Hamilcar, that was the picture I showed you, a Hamilcar glider that had the tank in it, and our fighters and vehicles and tons of supplies, and all to try to advance, surprise attack, paratrooper drop, elaborate plan to get into Germany. Perhaps you enjoyed this story about how a man had his commanding officer was wounded, and he takes him to the doctor, and the doctor's like, you'll have to wait your turn. And so this man pulls out his gun, his 45 pistol, and says, "I will kill you if you don't take a look at my commanding officer right now." And so the doctor operates, and the other guy holds the gun on him. And then when it's done, the man says, "Okay." He hands his 45 to the doctor and says, "You can turn me in now." And it says, "Hey, this is a court-martial offense," which means you'd get kicked out of the military, or worse. And he says, "I'm placing you under arrest." And then he says, "For 1 minute," and then he dismisses him. So he saved a man's life by his courage to pull a gun on the doctor. Kind of a crazy story. The next part here is on Colonel John Frost. So that's on the bottom here. Colonel Frost was on the bridge in Arnhem. That was called the Bridge Too Far. And Frost held the bridge heroically, because he was supposed to hold the bridge until the Allied tanks got there and reinforcements. And he held at all costs until him and his men were killed. And just the difficulties, the hours they fought waiting for reinforcements. It says they had been fighting without let up for 50 hours, hiding in buildings and fighting against superior German forces. And it says their friends died all around them, etc. And then there's this kind of story about how they said, "Well, Father," speaking to this priest, "they're throwing everything at us but the kitchen stove." And then right after he said that, the building took a hit and the ceiling fell in, and right in front of them was the kitchen stove that had fallen through. And he says, "Wow, I knew the Germans were close, but I didn't know they could hear us talking." I thought that was funny. That's why I included it. All right, and then the last little piece is just kind of the heroics to get across this bridge, one of the different bridges, not the Arnhem Bridge. And when we finally crossed the bridge, the Germans tried to blow it up because they had charges on it to try to take out our tanks, and it failed. And the note here is that Cornelius Ryan, the author of the book, feels like a Dutch resistance fighter, Jan van Hoof, had infiltrated German lines and was responsible for why the bridge didn't blow. So there's a heroic story. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so the battle was a fail. Frost and his men were killed on the bridge. And so I've been to Arnhem twice when I was in the Netherlands. And the last time I went, we stopped at this Arnhem cemetery for the paratroopers who died in Market Garden. And it's just tucked way back outside of town. It's in the woods. It's a very serene setting. Like you wouldn't even know, like you have to go on some dirt roads to get back there. You wouldn't even know it was there necessarily. And then these gravestones, remarkably in good shape. And a lot of them, you know, have these Bible texts or sayings at the bottom. You know, so this fella here died 19 years old. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Very prominent verse. But it was just very serene, very sobering to read the epitaphs on these stones about these young men who gave their lives. So this is a plaque just talking about the thing in general. And then here's the stone at the, you can see kind of the whole of the cemetery here. "Their name liveth forevermore," it says. This was the Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery for the British 1st Airborne division, as well as Polish. Here's that text again. Greater love hath no man than this, they lay down his life for his friends. So it's 50 years ago, British and Polish airborne soldiers fought here against overwhelming odds to open the way into Germany and to bring the war to an early end. Instead, we brought death and destruction for which you have never blamed us. That's into the Netherlands. This stone marks our admiration for your great courage, remembering especially the women who tended our wounded. In the long winter that followed, your families risked death by hiding Allied soldiers and airmen, while members of the resistance helped many to safety. You took us then into your homes as fugitives and friends. We took you forever into our hearts. This strong bond will continue long after we're all gone. All right, so this is Bernard Montgomery, the British general who's kind of the one who conceived this operation. And this is John Frost, who died on the bridge. Here's a bridge over the river. This is now called the John Frost Bridge. There's a pedestrian walkway here. You can see the bikers on it. So there's the bridge in 1944, German pillboxes and artillery, etc., tanks. This is a plaque. The picture quality is not very good, I apologize, but this is a picture I took. Explains the poor quality, in memory of John Frost and the airborne troops. This is actually on the bridge. It's not very much advertised. Like, you kind of have to know what you're looking for when you walk on the bridge, but it is there. All right, so we're going to shift gears now and look at the Battle of the Bulge. So going to our notes, we just looked at Operation Market Garden, and now we're on Battle of the Bulge, December of 1944 through January of 1945. So context here, Market Garden has failed. So you can see this is the Netherlands here. And the green, this is actually right after the Battle of the Bulge, right towards the end of it, this map. The context here is that we're pushing towards Germany. We basically reached the Siegfried Line, the west wall, in red here. Remember that from the documentary, talks about the Siegfried Line a bit, this massive German defense. And we were going to push into Germany, and the Germans, Hitler, seeing our advance, saw that we were kind of overextended, especially by the Ardennes, which is where in Belgium, where he pushed through at the beginning of the war, which would trap the British and the French at Dunkirk. And so you can see the kind of the bulge. That's why it's called the Battle of the bulge in the line here. And so Hitler was like, hey, we're just going to hit him with everything we've got. And his goal was to push us all the way back through Belgium. And he thought he could capture our fuel, and he could basically give us such a crushing defeat that it would force us to surrender. It was crazy, but that's what he thought. And he was committing extra forces to this attack and to catch us by surprise and stop the Allied advance. He was really putting all his eggs in one basket here, attacking this 80-mile stretch of American lines. Part of it, too, was to save historical cities like Aachen, right here. Aachen was a city that was established by Charlemagne way back around 800 AD. And in Hitler's mind, Charlemagne, who was Germanic, he was a Frank, but that's a Germanic people. He considered Charlemagne as establishing the First Reich, the first empire, German empire. And then the Holy Roman Empire would be the Second Reich. And then, of course, he thought he was establishing the Third Reich. And so he ordered that his men keep Aachen he said, you know, even if you have to be buried in the city's ruins. All right, so the battle begins in December of 1944. It's winter, it's brutally cold, and the Americans really aren't prepared for this battle as far as clothing and to withstand the German attack. So here you can actually see the Bulge. This is more of a close-up. You see Bastogne, which was surrounded by the Germans, but we held it throughout the battle. So we'll talk about that. But you see the front line at the start of the offensive was way up here at the German border. And then by December 20, 4 days later, we'd been pushed back to basically where Bastogne is here and around St. Vith. And then by Christmas time, we are pushed way back into Belgium, but we still held Bastogne. And so hence we call it the Battle of the Bulge, right? Because we bulged, because of the German counterattack, our lines bulged. All right, there's lots going on here. So this is just a tank comparison. So there was, you know, the big German tanks, the Panzer tank. They had a bunch of Panzer tanks in Market Garden, but they had some Tiger tanks here at the Battle of the Bulge, and these are just kind of struck fear because they were very. I mean, it's kind of, people have different opinions on the Tiger tank, but the ones that actually performed well were pretty scary. There's a Tiger tank in the Battle of Kursk, for example, in Russia, that took out over 20 Russian tanks all by itself and took numerous shell hits, but the armor was so thick on the Tiger tank and the shells so strong that the Tiger tank was formidable. Here's a picture of a Tiger tank. But they're super expensive and not always reliable, so there's some knocks on them. All right, other things of interest in the Battle of the Bulge. This man was Otto Skorzeny. He actually rescued Mussolini from prison in a daring rescue after the Allies invaded Italy. In the Battle of the Bulge, so you can see the SS badge on his collar. He gathered a lot of American, English-speaking German soldiers, and they stole American uniforms and jeeps, and they went behind enemy lines before the attack that started the Battle of the Bulge, and they changed road signs, the directions of where things were. They basically used their spying positions to report back to the Germans. They basically created terror in the American lines. And so it got to the point where the Americans had to have all these checkpoints where they, any vehicle or group of soldiers, they had to basically show that they were really Americans and not Germans in disguise, because these German spies were wearing American uniforms. There's a humorous story of how some guards stopped Omar Bradley, who was a high-ranking American general, and they asked him 3 different questions to try to prove that he was really an American. So they asked him, like in American football, different positions in the offensive line, and one of the questions they asked him was, "What's the capital of Illinois?" And he correctly responded, "Springfield," but the guard thought the capital of Illinois was Chicago, so they actually detained the general, and the soldier was wrong. So that's kind of a humorous story. But anyway, so there's German spies operating behind our lines. There's also, in the course of the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans massacred 80 American prisoners of war. The SS did. And so that story was going around as well. This is a map we had looking back at D-Day, so maybe you recognize it, but I pulled it back up here because the reason why thinking at the Battle of the Bulge, we were very interested in Antwerp, this Belgian city, this Belgian port. Up to this point, we had still been dropping in our supplies at the D-Day beaches and pushing them all the way across France to get to the front lines. And that was using an enormous amount of fuel, and fuel was at a premium. Or we were dropping troops in at Marseille off the Mediterranean Sea and pushing them up into France this way. And so part of the reason for like Market Garden up here in the Netherlands was because we were trying to open this port at Antwerp so that we could drop men and supplies here rather than having to truck them in all the way across France. And the problem, Eisenhower, who was supreme commander of the Allied forces, one of the problems he was running into was that he couldn't supply the northern force that was largely Bernard Montgomery with oil and gas, and the southern force, which was run by General Patton and his Third Army at the same time. And so that was a point of contention between Patton and Montgomery that Eisenhower found himself in the middle of. Another reason of the importance of this battle was because the Germans were firing V-2 rockets into Britain, specifically London. So this V-2 rocket was a brand new missile that the Germans developed that could be launched from Germany or occupied territory and go a long way and cause damage. This was more of a terror instrument. The Germans would fire over 1,000 of these into Britain by the end of the war, and we were trying to fight to help shut that down. All right, getting back to the battle itself, we were having all kinds of issues in the Battle of the Bulge. Our men were pinned down by the German attack, and our men were not outfitted for the cold weather, and so men were suffering from frostbite. We would have 15,000 casualties in this battle because of frostbite. And so the problem was with our boots, they just didn't breathe well. And so these men, every day, you were supposed to change your socks. So that's kind of hard to do when it's 0 degrees or colder outside. The last thing you want to do is take off your boots and socks in a foxhole when it's freezing cold. But basically, there's stories of how, in order to keep their feet from frostbite, you'd have to take your boots off and your socks and put a new pair of socks on. And you couldn't sleep with your boots on. And then men would massage each other's feet. And so you just kind of picture that, what it would be like to be under German artillery attack or had been under attack, and you're in your foxhole in the frozen ground, it's freezing cold, and you're there with another man and you're massaging each other's feet to try to prevent frostbite. But that was a reality of this battle. Another problem we had was weather. Because of cloud cover and snow, etc. Our planes couldn't bomb German tanks, etc. Because we had problems earlier, because what started this battle is the Germans basically were recruiting anyone who could hold a gun. So they were recruiting, conscripting rather, German boys, young teenagers, 14, 15 years old, all the way up to men up to 60 years old. And they weren't really training them. They just needed mass amounts of men because the Russians were pushing in from the east and the Allies from the British and the Americans from the west. And so they basically did like a human wave of these untrained boys and old men and everything in between. And then they hit us with Tiger tanks. And normally we would just send in our planes to bomb them. But because of the weather, we couldn't risk that, because as we saw in the documentary, dropping bombs for our own men was a real thing. If we couldn't use that northern bomb site under cloud cover, it wasn't near as accurate. So we also had problems with men suffering from shell shock or battle fatigue, or maybe PTSD, where men, under this artillery barrage of the Germans and just the harsh conditions, the cold weather, etc., they freaked out. They kind of lost their minds temporarily. And this was like, once some people experienced this, it was it kind of spread a little bit. It's not like it's contagious, but fear in some ways is contagious. Despair is contagious. And so that was a thing that we struggled with. All right, going back to the battle itself, looking at this strategic town, Bastogne, the Germans laid siege to it, and we had the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were holding down this town, led by General Anthony McAuliffe. And when the Germans came and demanded his complete surrender or face annihilation, his single word response was nuts. And so he refused to surrender the town, and they held out. Now, looking at this map, so here's Bastogne, and coming up from the south was the U.S. Third Army under General Patton. General Patton was one of our best generals. We first met him in the North Africa campaign, and he, using the intelligence resources he had and his very senior staff around him, he was convinced the Germans would try this type of counterattack before it even happened. And he was prepared to rush north with his tanks to bust right into the German lines and blow their counterattack apart. And just after Christmas, he entered Bastogne. Now, if you ask someone from the Third Army and General Patton who saved Bastogne, he would confidently say it was the Third Army. And without them, Bastogne would have been lost. If you talk to someone from the 101st Airborne, I'm quite certain they will tell you that they were holding out and they didn't need Patton's help. So it's a kind of a matter of pride in the Army who was responsible for holding Bastogne. Like the Third Army wants to take all the credit, but it was really the 101st Airborne, that kind of a thing. So this is a picture of General Eisenhower. This is Omar Bradley, who I mentioned in that story, another general who was detained because they thought he was a German spy temporarily. And then here's General Patton. So let's just look at significance of the Battle of the Bulge. So this was Hitler's last great attempt to push the Allies back. He put all his eggs in this basket. After we won the Battle of the Bulge. So after we defeated the Germans were in a terrible position. They had taken reinforcements that should have went to fight the Russians, to fight us. It delayed our advance a couple of months, but it exhausted billions of gallons of fuel, and the Germans were running out of fuel. That's part of the reason why this counterattack kind of died, was they were supposed to capture key American fuel depots, and they didn't, and their tanks ran out of gas, and they just didn't have the resources anymore to press their advantage. From an American perspective, this battle haunted many of our veterans, the survivors of this battle. Just the horror of it, to be under constant German artillery barrage, to be stuck in a foxhole in frozen forests, and all through the night, cut off, as it were. The mass amount of casualties. This was the largest battle the American Army had ever been in. We had over 500,000 men committed to this battle on the German border. Some men say that survivors said that they couldn't go into the woods at night. They were just terrified because of their experiences at the Battle of the Bulge. Others say that every time it got cold, like their feet getting cold, like took them right back to this battle. And memories of their buddies getting blown up by artillery, and just the horror of the Battle of the Bulge. So that's kind of the story. We stopped Hitler's counterattack. We had a lot of losses, but we were able to push forward. And so by the following spring, the war would end. We would be in Germany. We would cross the Rhine. river into Germany, and we would force the Germans to surrender in May of 1945. So you see on the notes then, other key events. Franklin Roosevelt, who had recently been elected to his 4th term as president in November of 1944, would die from a stroke April 12, 1945. So the anniversary of that event is in just a few days. Hitler, realizing that the war was lost and the Russians were on the borders of Berlin and his Third Reich was crumbled, committed suicide April 30, 1945. The fighting in Italy, which had been going on ever since we invaded years before, ended May 2, and then Germany would surrender May 7. And then Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, it was called, was May 8, 1945. So, all right, hopefully you learned a lot. If you have questions, feel free to email me, and we will talk about the completion of the battle against the Japanese next week.